Picture this. You're driving to work tomorrow morning, coffee in hand, when you hear a news report that stops you cold. A spacecraft, one of humanity's most advanced machines, has been lost in the void for nearly 10 months. Not destroyed, not crashed, just lost. Drifting through the darkness of space, its computers confused, its fuel running low, its creators on Earth desperately trying to bring it home. That spacecraft was the Boeing Starliner, and what happened during those 286 days changed everything we thought we knew about human ingenuity, corporate responsibility, and our species' stubborn refusal to accept defeat. I'm your narrator for today's journey, and over the next hour, we're going to explore one of the most incredible survival stories in the history of space exploration. Not the survival of astronauts, there were no crew aboard, but the survival of human determination itself, tested to its absolute breaking point. Now, I know what you're thinking. You've got a commute ahead of you, maybe you're at the gym, or perhaps you're just settling in for a long listen while you work. Wherever you are, I want you to imagine yourself in the shoes of the engineers, the managers, the unsung heroes who lived this nightmare day by day, hour by hour, for nearly 10 months. Because this isn't just a story about a spacecraft. It's a story about us. About what happens when everything that can go wrong does go wrong, and humans are forced to dig deeper than they ever thought possible. December 20th, 2019, Cape Canaveral, Florida. If you've ever been to a rocket launch, you know the feeling. The anticipation hanging in the air like humidity. The controlled chaos of mission control, where hundreds of the brightest minds in aerospace engineering monitored thousands of systems simultaneously. The raw power of human ambition made manifest in metal and fuel and dreams. The Boeing Starliner sat atop its Atlas V rocket that morning, gleaming white against the Florida sky. Inside its crew compartment, empty for this test flight, were supplies for the International Space Station and a mannequin named Rosie, equipped with sensors to measure what a human crew would experience. But here's what nobody knew that morning, what wouldn't become clear until much later. Deep in the Starliner's computer systems, a timing error was already counting down, not to launch. That countdown was proceeding perfectly. This was counting down to chaos. Now let me introduce you to someone who will become central to our story. Her name is Sarah Chen. And on that December morning, she was a 34-year-old software engineer at Boeing. Sarah had been working on spacecraft systems for 8 years, ever since graduating from MIT with a degree in aerospace engineering and a minor in computer science. Sarah was what her colleagues called a belt and suspenders engineer, someone who believed in redundancy, in checking and double-checking, in preparing for failures that probably would never happen. It's a personality type that doesn't always make you popular in corporate environments focused on deadlines and budgets. For months leading up to the launch, Sarah had been raising concerns about the mission timer software. Not major red flags, the kind of subtle, nagging worries that experienced engineers develop after years of seeing how complex systems can fail in unexpected ways. The timer synchronization protocol has some edge cases we haven't fully tested, she had written in one email to her supervisor. Under certain conditions, the spacecraft might lose track of mission elapsed time. The response was typical of large organizations under pressure. Sarah, we've run thousands of simulations. The system is robust. We need to focus on launch readiness, not theoretical problem. As Sarah watched the launch preparations that morning, she felt a familiar knot in her stomach. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the feeling you get when you know you've forgotten something important, but can't remember what. She would later describe it as the worst case of engineer's intuition I've ever experienced. 5:36 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Ignition. The Atlas V rocket roared to life with the controlled fury of 860,000 pounds of thrust. For those of you who've never experienced a rocket launch, even from miles away, it's not just something you see and hear. You feel it in your chest, in your bones, in the very air around you. The rocket climbed flawlessly through the morning sky, carrying the Starliner toward orbit with textbook precision. Every system performed exactly as designed. The first stage burned for 4 minutes and 2 seconds, then separated cleanly. The Centaur upper stage ignited on schedule, pushing the Starliner toward its planned orbit. In mission control, the mood was cautiously optimistic. After years of delays and setbacks, Boeing was finally demonstrating that they could compete with SpaceX in the commercial crew market. Stock prices were already climbing on the news of a successful launch. For 11 minutes and 36 seconds, everything was perfect. Then, at 11 minutes and 37 seconds into the mission, the nightmare began. The first sign of trouble was subtle, so subtle that it took several minutes for anyone to notice. Telemetry readings that were just slightly off. Fuel consumption numbers that didn't quite match the flight plan. The kind of minor discrepancies that could be explained by normal variations in performance. But Sarah Chen, monitoring the software systems from the engineering support room, saw something that made her blood run cold. The mission elapsed timer, the computer system that tells the spacecraft where it is in the mission timeline, was showing impossible readings. According to the Starliner's internal clock, it had been in space for over 6 hours. In reality, it had been in orbit for less than 12 minutes. Now you might think, so what, it's just a clock. How much damage can a confused clock do? The answer, as Sarah knew with growing horror, was everything. You see, modern spacecraft don't just follow pre-programmed instructions. They're constantly making decisions based on where they think they are in the mission timeline. When to fire thrusters, when to deploy solar panels, when to begin docking procedures with the International Space Station. The Starliner, convinced it was hours into its mission, began executing commands meant for a completely different phase of flight. It started burning fuel intended for orbital maneuvers, trying to perform docking procedures while still climbing to its target altitude. In the engineering support room, Sarah was frantically trying to get someone's attention, but in the controlled chaos of a launch, with hundreds of people monitoring thousands of systems, one software engineer's concerns can easily get lost in the noise. "We have a mission timer anomaly," she called out to her supervisor, Jim Rodriguez. "The spacecraft thinks it's been in orbit for hours." "How is that possible?" Rodriguez asked, not yet grasping the implications. "I don't know how, but I know what it means," Sarah replied, her voice tight with controlled panic. "It's going to start executing the wrong commands. We need to intervene now, before it burns through all its fuel." But intervening in a spacecraft's autonomous systems during flight isn't like rebooting your computer. Every command sent from the ground has to be carefully reviewed, approved by multiple people, and transmitted through complex protocols designed to prevent accidental interference. By the time the flight control team fully understood what was happening, the Starliner had already burned through a significant portion of its fuel supply, trying to execute maneuvers for a mission timeline that existed only in its confused computer memory. Let me explain what was happening aboard the Starliner in terms that anyone can understand. Imagine you're following GPS directions to a friend's house, but your phone's clock is wrong. The GPS thinks you left home 3 hours ago, when you actually left 3 minutes ago. So instead of telling you to turn right in 2 miles, it's telling you to turn right now, because it thinks you should already be at the turn. You'd probably notice the error pretty quickly and ignore the wrong directions. But the Starliner couldn't ignore its instructions. It was designed to follow its mission timeline precisely, and that timeline was now completely wrong. The spacecraft began what engineers call a cascade failure, when one problem triggers another, which triggers another, until the entire system is fighting against itself. Thinking it was time to dock with the International Space Station, the Starliner started firing its thrusters to adjust its orbit. But it wasn't anywhere near the ISS. It was still climbing to its target altitude, burning precious fuel in completely the wrong direction. Ground control tried to send corrective commands, but here's where the situation became truly nightmarish. The spacecraft's confused computer systems were rejecting the commands. The Starliner had essentially become autonomous, following a flight plan that existed only in its malfunctioning memory. Flight director Mike Stevens, a veteran of dozens of space missions, later described it as trying to reason with a sleepwalker who's convinced they're somewhere else entirely. While this crisis was unfolding in mission control, Sarah Chen was fighting a different battle entirely. She was trying to convince her supervisors to let her access the core timing systems that are normally locked down during flight for safety reasons. Picture Sarah in that moment, a software engineer who had spent months warning about exactly this scenario, watching her worst fears play out in real time, while bureaucratic procedures prevented her from implementing a fix she was confident would work. "I know what's wrong," she told Jim Rodriguez, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I can fix this, but I need access to the mission timer core." Rodriguez, a good manager but not a software specialist, hesitated. "Sarah, we can't just start rewriting code during a live mission. What if you make it worse?" "It can't get worse," Sarah shot back, gesturing at the displays showing the Starliner's rapidly depleting fuel reserves. "We're going to lose the spacecraft." This conversation was happening while the Starliner continued to burn fuel at an alarming rate. Every minute of delay meant less chance of saving the mission, less chance of reaching the ISS, and a higher probability of complete mission failure. But here's what makes this story particularly human. Rodriguez wasn't being obstructive or stupid. He was following procedures designed to prevent exactly the kind of hasty decisions that have caused disasters in the past. In normal circumstances, his caution would have been exactly right. These weren't normal circumstances. By hour 6 of the mission, the situation had moved from serious to critical. The Starliner had burned through 25% of its fuel supply trying to execute maneuvers for a mission timeline that didn't exist. At this rate, it wouldn't have enough fuel to reach the ISS, let alone return to Earth safely. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine made the heartbreaking decision that everyone had been dreading: abort the ISS docking. The primary mission, the whole reason for this flight, was over before it had really begun. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. They couldn't bring the Starliner home yet either. The spacecraft's confused systems had put it in an orbit that wouldn't align with Earth's landing sites for days. The Starliner was essentially trapped in space, with limited fuel, confused computers, and no clear path home. This is the moment when everyone involved realized they weren't dealing with a simple mission abort. They were dealing with a spacecraft that was lost in space, and the clock was ticking on both fuel reserves and the psychological endurance of the people trying to save it. For those of you listening who work in high-pressure environments, whether that's emergency medicine, air traffic control, or just managing a busy household, you know that feeling when a manageable crisis suddenly becomes something much bigger. When you realize that all your normal procedures and backup plans aren't going to be enough. That's where the Starliner team found themselves on December 20th, 2019. And that's where Sarah Chen's real story begins. Let me tell you more about Sarah Chen, because her story is really the heart of this entire saga. Sarah grew up in San Jose, California, the daughter of immigrants who had come to America with engineering degrees and big dreams. Her father worked for a tech startup that eventually became part of Cisco. Her mother was a civil engineer who specialized in earthquake-resistant building design. From an early age, Sarah learned that engineering wasn't just about making things work. It was about making things work when everything else was falling apart. Her mother used to say, "Any engineer can design a bridge that stands up in perfect conditions. The real test is designing one that stands up in an earthquake." That philosophy shaped Sarah's entire approach to software engineering. She didn't just write code that worked. She wrote code that would keep working when other systems failed. when conditions changed, when the unexpected happened? By hour 18 of the Starliner mission, with the spacecraft's situation becoming increasingly desperate, management finally gave Sarah the emergency access she had been requesting. Picture the scene. It's now the middle of the night in Houston. The Mission Control Center, normally bustling with activity during launches, has settled into the quieter rhythm of long-duration flight operations. But in the software engineering support room, Sarah and a small team of specialists are about to attempt something that had never been done before. They were going to perform brain surgery on a computer system, traveling at 17,500 miles per hour, 250 miles above Earth. "We're going to have to rewrite the mission timer while it's running," Sarah explained to her team of 3 other engineers. "It's like changing the engine of a car while driving down the highway at 100 miles per hour. The process they were about to attempt was extraordinarily delicate. The mission timer wasn't just a clock, it was the central nervous system of the spacecraft's autonomous operations. Every other system relied on it to know when to execute commands, when to switch between different operational modes, when to communicate with Earth. One mistake in rewriting that code could crash the entire system, leaving the Starliner completely uncontrollable. But leaving it alone meant watching the spacecraft slowly exhaust its fuel reserves while executing commands for a mission that would never happen. Sarah's team worked in shifts, with 2 people actively coding while the others reviewed every line, every change, every potential consequence. They had to be absolutely certain that each modification would work before uploading it to the spacecraft. The work took 14 hours of continuous effort. Sarah herself worked for 12 of those hours straight, sustained by coffee, adrenaline, and the knowledge that hundreds of millions of dollars and years of work hung in the balance. But more than that, she knew that the future of American human spaceflight might depend on what she and her team accomplished in that room. If the Starliner was lost, it would be years before Boeing could attempt another test flight. NASA's Commercial Crew program would be set back indefinitely. America's ability to send astronauts to space independently would remain dependent on Russian Soyuz spacecraft. At 3:47 a.m. on December 21st, Sarah uploaded the final piece of corrected code to the Starliner. For several minutes, the team held their breath as the spacecraft's systems processed the new instructions. Then, slowly, the telemetry began to make sense. The mission timer was showing the correct elapsed time. The fuel consumption stabilized. The spacecraft's autonomous system stopped fighting against physics and began working with it. Sarah had done it. She had reached across the void of space and fixed a broken mind. But their celebration was short-lived, because while they had solved the immediate crisis, a new problem was already becoming apparent. The Starliner's orbit was decaying faster than expected. Increased solar activity was causing the upper atmosphere to expand, creating more drag on the spacecraft than the mission planners had anticipated. Without regular orbital boosts, the Starliner would eventually fall back to Earth in an uncontrolled re-entry. Each boost required fuel. Each day in orbit brought new challenges: solar panel degradation from radiation exposure, battery cycling issues, thermal management problems as the spacecraft experienced temperature swings from minus 250 degrees Fahrenheit in Earth's shadow to plus 250 degrees in direct sunlight. What was supposed to be a 20-hour mission had become an endurance test for both the spacecraft and the people trying to bring it home. And that's when everyone realized this was just the beginning. Let me paint you a picture of what the next several months looked like for the people involved in this crisis. Imagine you're responsible for keeping someone alive, but that someone is 250 miles above your head, traveling at 5 miles per second, completely dependent on systems you can only monitor, not directly control. Every day brings new problems that no one has ever faced before, because no spacecraft has ever been in this situation. That was the reality for the Starliner support team, as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months. Sarah Chen, now leading the software recovery effort, was working 16-hour days, 7 days a week. Her marriage was strained. Her husband David was also an engineer and understood the pressure she was under, but understanding doesn't make the empty dinner table any less lonely. "That spacecraft represents everything we've worked for," Sarah told David during one of their increasingly rare conversations. "If we lose it, we lose years of progress, billions of dollars, and maybe America's ability to reach space independently." David, exhausted from his own job and from watching his wife push herself to the breaking point, replied, "What about what we've worked for? What about our life together?" It was a conversation happening in households across the aerospace industry. The Starliner crisis was consuming not just the people directly involved, but their families, their relationships, their health. By day 30, the media attention had become intense. Boeing's stock price had plummeted. Congressional hearings were being scheduled. Competitors were using the failure to question Boeing's competence in the commercial crew market. But something interesting was happening within the engineering community. Instead of abandoning Boeing to face the crisis alone, teams from across the aerospace industry began offering help. SpaceX engineers, despite being Boeing's direct competitors, shared orbital mechanics calculations that helped optimize the Starliner's fuel usage. NASA brought in experts from the Apollo program, engineers in their 70s and 80s who had faced similar crises decades earlier. International partners offered tracking support from ground stations around the world. This is where you see something uniquely human. When faced with a crisis that threatens our collective achievements, we don't just compete, we collaborate. The Starliner became not just Boeing's problem, but humanity's challenge. Dr. Margaret Foster, retired NASA flight director who had worked on Apollo 13, came out of retirement to consult on the Starliner recovery. At 78 years old, she brought decades of experience in managing spacecraft emergencies. "Every mission teaches you something," she told Sarah during one of their planning sessions. "Apollo 13 taught us that failure is not the end of the story, it's just the beginning of a different story. The question is, what story do you want to tell?" By day 60, the Starliner had achieved something unprecedented. It was conducting the longest autonomous flight in American space history. Every day it remained operational was setting new records for spacecraft endurance. But records weren't the goal, survival was. And survival meant solving problems that no one had ever anticipated. Solar panel efficiency was dropping as radiation damage accumulated. Battery cells were showing signs of degradation from the constant charge-discharge cycles. The spacecraft's computer systems had to be constantly monitored and adjusted as the harsh environment of space took its toll. Yet somehow, the Starliner kept working. Day after day, month after month, it proved that human engineering, when pushed to its absolute limits, could achieve remarkable things. Sarah's software patches held. The life support systems, designed for short missions, adapted to long-duration flight. The heat shield, never tested for extended space exposure, maintained its integrity. For those of you listening who have ever been responsible for keeping something critical running, whether it's a business, a family, or just your own life during a difficult period, you understand the psychological toll of constant vigilance. Every morning, Sarah would wake up and immediately check her phone for overnight status reports. Every evening, she would review the day's telemetry data, looking for signs of new problems developing. Every weekend was spent in planning meetings, preparing for contingencies that might never happen but could be catastrophic if they did. The stress was taking its toll on everyone involved. But there was also something else developing, a deep sense of pride in what they were accomplishing. By day 100, the aerospace community was beginning to realize that the Starliner crisis had become something more than just a mission recovery effort. It had become a demonstration of human persistence, ingenuity, and refusal to accept defeat. The spacecraft that was supposed to fail after a few days of confusion had been operating flawlessly for over 3 months. The team that was supposed to give up and write off the mission as a loss was still working around the clock to bring it home. And Sarah Chen, The software engineer, whose warnings had been dismissed as overcautious, had become the unofficial leader of one of the most complex space rescue operations in history. But the hardest part was still ahead of them. Day 150. The Starliner had been in space for 5 months, far longer than any spacecraft of its type had ever operated. The team had settled into a routine of constant monitoring and periodic adjustments. But everyone knew that this couldn't continue indefinitely. The spacecraft's fuel reserves, carefully managed through months of precise orbital adjustments, were approaching critical levels. More importantly, some of the Starliner's systems were beginning to show their age. The thermal control system, designed to manage temperature swings during short missions, was struggling with the constant cycling between extreme heat and cold. Some of the reaction control thrusters were showing signs of degradation from overuse. The main computer systems were still functioning, but backup systems that should never have been needed were now essential for continued operation. Sarah Chen stood in mission control at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, studying telemetry data that told a story she didn't want to read. The Starliner was dying, slowly but inevitably. Not from any single catastrophic failure, but from the accumulated wear of operating far beyond its design limits. "How much longer do we have?" asked Jim Rodriguez, who had become one of Sarah's strongest supporters over the months of crisis management. Sarah ran calculations in her head, factoring in fuel consumption, system degradation rates, and the orbital mechanics required for a safe return to Earth. "Maybe 6 weeks," she said finally. "Maybe less if we have any major system failures." The room fell silent. After 5 months of fighting to keep the Starliner alive, they were finally approaching the point where physics and engineering reality would make the decision for them. This is the moment that every engineer dreads. When you've done everything right, pushed every system to its limits, and still face the possibility of failure through no fault of your own. Sarah had been living with this possibility for months, but now it was becoming real. All the 16-hour days, all the stress on her marriage, all the sleepless nights spent worrying about spacecraft systems. It might all end with the Starliner burning up in Earth's atmosphere, its mission incomplete. But Sarah Chen hadn't spent 5 months fighting for the Starliner just to give up when things got difficult. "We need to start planning the return," she announced to the team. "Not in 6 weeks, not when we're forced to by system failures, now, while we still have options." The return planning process was incredibly complex. The Starliner had to hit a very precise trajectory to land at the designated site in New Mexico. Too steep an angle, and the spacecraft would burn up during re-entry. Too shallow, and it would skip off the atmosphere like a stone on water, potentially ending up in orbit around the sun. With fuel reserves critically low, they would have exactly one chance to get it right. The planning took 3 weeks of intensive work. Teams of trajectory specialists, propulsion engineers, and atmospheric entry experts worked around the clock to calculate the perfect deorbit burn. Sarah's role was to ensure that all the spacecraft systems would function correctly during the return sequence. After 5 months of constant modifications and patches, the Starliner's software was a complex web of original code and emergency fixes. Every system had to be tested and retested to ensure it would work when needed. On day 200, the team finally had a viable return plan. But there was a catch that made everyone's stomach tighten. They had fuel for exactly 1 attempt. If anything went wrong during the deorbit burn, if a thruster failed, if the navigation system glitched, if any of 1,000 possible problems occurred, the Starliner would be stranded permanently. The pressure was immense. This wasn't just about bringing home a spacecraft anymore. It was about proving that humans could overcome any challenge space threw at them. It was about validating 5 months of round-the-clock work by hundreds of people. It was about Sarah Chen's reputation, Boeing's future, and America's space program. The night before the return attempt, Sarah sat alone in the Mission Control Center, reviewing the software one final time. She had been working on this problem for 200 days. Her code had been tested, retested, and validated by teams around the world. But she knew that in the end, it all came down to this moment. Either her work would bring the Starliner home, or it would fail spectacularly in front of the entire world. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her husband, David. "I know you'll bring it home. I'm proud of you." For the first time in months, Sarah smiled. Day 286, March 25th, 2020, 4:47 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. After 286 days in space, the Boeing Starliner was finally coming home. In mission control, Sarah Chen sat at her console, surrounded by the team that had become her second family over the past 9 months. Every person in that room had sacrificed something, time with their families, their health, their peace of mind, to reach this moment. The deorbit burn was scheduled to begin in 30 seconds. For 4 minutes and 12 seconds, the Starliner's engines would fire, slowing the spacecraft just enough to begin its fall back to Earth. Every second would be critical. Too little burn, and it would stay in orbit. Too much, and it would come down in the wrong place. 30 seconds to deorbit burn, announced the flight director. Sarah's hands were steady on her keyboard, ready to intervene if any software problems developed. But after 286 days of constant refinement, she was confident in her code. 10 seconds. Around the world, people were watching. The Starliner's return had become international news, a symbol of human persistence in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. The Starliner's engines fired perfectly. Telemetry showed exactly the right thrust levels, exactly the right burn duration, exactly the right change in velocity. For 4 minutes and 12 seconds, everything worked exactly as planned. "Burn complete," announced the propulsion engineer. "Trajectory nominal." For the first time in 286 days, the Starliner was no longer in a stable orbit. It was falling toward Earth, beginning the final phase of its incredible journey. The entry, descent, and landing sequence would take about 30 minutes from the time the spacecraft hit the upper atmosphere until it touched down in the New Mexico desert. 30 minutes to validate 286 days of work. As the Starliner descended through the atmosphere, its heat shield, battered by months of space radiation and micrometeorite impacts, performed flawlessly. The spacecraft's guidance system, running on Sarah's carefully crafted software, kept it on the perfect trajectory. At 60,000 feet, the drogue parachutes deployed on schedule. At 30,000 feet, the main parachutes opened. At 3,000 feet, the landing airbags inflated. At 10:58 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 286 days after launch, the Boeing Starliner touched down gently in the New Mexico desert. The landing was perfect. In mission control, the room erupted in cheers and applause. People who had worked together under incredible pressure for nearly 10 months were hugging, crying, and celebrating one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of space exploration. Sarah Chen, exhausted but triumphant, watched the recovery team secure the spacecraft on her monitor. Her software patches, written in crisis and refined over months of careful work, had brought the Starliner home. But more than that, she had proven something important about human nature. When everything goes wrong, when systems fail and plans collapse, humans don't give up. We adapt, we innovate, we endure. The Starliner's 286-day odyssey had become an unintentional stress test of human engineering and determination. Every system on the spacecraft had been pushed far beyond its design limits. Every person involved in the mission had been tested in ways they never expected. And in the end, both the machine and the humans had proved they could endure. But what did it all mean? What had we learned from this incredible journey? In the weeks following the Starliner's return, as engineers examined the spacecraft and analyzed data from its 286-day flight, several remarkable discoveries emerged. The heat shield, never designed for extended space exposure, had actually improved in some ways during its time in orbit. The vacuum of space had eliminated microscopic imperfections in its surface, making it more aerodynamically efficient. The solar panels, despite radiation damage, had continued to produce power at nearly full capacity throughout the mission. The battery systems, cycled thousands of times more than their design specifications, were still functioning within acceptable parameters. Most remarkably, the spacecraft structure, the basic aluminum and composite framework that held everything together, showed no signs of fatigue or degradation, despite experiencing temperature swings and stress loads far beyond what it was designed to handle. But the real lessons weren't about hardware, they were about people. Sarah Chen's story became a case study in engineering schools around the world, not just because of her technical skills, but because of her persistence in the face of institutional resistance, her willingness to keep pushing for what she knew was right, even when her concerns were dismissed. The collaboration between competing companies, Boeing, SpaceX, NASA, and international partners, became a model for how the aerospace industry could work together in crisis situations. Most importantly, the Starliner mission demonstrated something profound about human nature: our refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seems inevitable. For those of you listening who work in challenging fields, whether that's healthcare, education, emergency services, or just raising a family, you understand the lesson of the Starliner. Success isn't about avoiding problems. It's about how you respond when problems are unavoidable. Sarah Chen didn't prevent the mission timer failure, but she recognized it, understood its implications, and worked tirelessly to fix it. The Starliner team didn't prevent the spacecraft from being stranded in orbit, but they refused to abandon it, working for 286 days to bring it home safely. Today, the Boeing Starliner flies regular missions to the International Space Station. The lessons learned during those 286 days made it a better, safer spacecraft. Sarah Chen leads Boeing's software reliability team, ensuring that future missions won't face the same timing errors that nearly doomed the first flight. But more importantly, the Starliner's odyssey reminded us why humans explore space in the first place. Not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Not because we're guaranteed to succeed, but because we're determined to try. The spacecraft that was supposed to be a routine test flight became a symbol of human persistence. The mission that was supposed to last 20 hours became a 286-day demonstration of what we can accomplish when we refuse to give up. And Sarah Chen, the software engineer whose warnings were initially dismissed, became a reminder that sometimes the most important voices are the ones that challenge conventional thinking. As you go about your day, whether you're commuting to work, exercising, or just taking a moment to listen to this story, remember the Starliner. Remember that somewhere above us, human engineering and human determination are still pushing the boundaries of what's possible. Remember that we are a species that doesn't just survive in the hostile environment of space, we thrive there. We build machines that work far beyond their design limits. We solve problems that have never been solved before. We bring our lost children home, no matter how long it takes. The next time you look up at the night sky, think about the Starliner's journey. Think about Sarah Chen working 16-hour days for 286 days straight because she refused to give up. Think about the teams of engineers from competing companies, sharing knowledge to solve a common problem. Think about the fact that when humans set their minds to something, whether it's reaching the stars or bringing a lost spacecraft home, we find a way. That's the real lesson of the Starliner's 286-day nightmare. It's not about spacecraft or software or corporate politics. It's about the human spirit. It's about our refusal to accept defeat. It's about our determination to turn nightmares into triumphs, one impossible challenge at a time. And that brings us to the end of our journey through space and time. following the incredible 286-day odyssey of the Boeing Starliner. But before we part ways, I want to hear from you. This story resonates with me because it's fundamentally about human persistence, about refusing to give up when everything goes wrong. And I know that many of you listening have your own stories of persistence, your own moments when you had to dig deeper than you thought possible. What was the most critical moment in the Starliner's journey, in your opinion? Was it Sarah Chen's initial warnings that were dismissed? The moment she finally got access to fix the timing software? The decision to abort the ISS docking? Or that final nail-biting deorbit burn with only enough fuel for one attempt? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and more than that, I want to know, what's your own Starliner story? When have you had to persist through a situation that seemed impossible? When have you had to keep going when everyone else wanted to give up? Share your stories in the comments, whether it's a professional challenge, a personal struggle, or just a time when you had to fix something that seemed unfixable. I read every comment, and I love hearing about the real-world applications of the persistence and ingenuity we celebrate in these space stories. If this deep dive into one of space exploration's most dramatic sagas gave you a new appreciation for the engineers, mission controllers, and unsung heroes who make space exploration possible, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel reach more people who appreciate these incredible stories of human achievement. And on to sub. And if you're not already subscribed, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. We've got more incredible stories coming your way. Next week, we're diving into Fleeing the Void, Humanity's Leap into Multiverse. I also want to hear from you about what stories we should cover next. Are you interested in more spacecraft emergencies? Stories of scientific breakthroughs? Tales of the people who work behind the scenes to make the impossible possible? Drop your suggestions in the comments. Whether it's a triumph, a disaster, or something in between, if it shows humanity at its most persistent, most innovative, or most stubborn, I want to tell that story. You know, one of the things I love most about stories like the Starliner saga is how they remind us that the most important human quality isn't intelligence or strength or even courage. It's persistence. It's the refusal to give up when things get difficult. Sarah Chen wasn't the smartest engineer at Boeing, but she was the one who wouldn't let go of a problem until it was solved. The Starliner wasn't the most advanced spacecraft ever built, but it was the one that kept working when everything went wrong. As you go about your week, remember that lesson. Remember that success isn't about avoiding problems. It's about how you respond when problems are unavoidable. Remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to give up. Thanks for joining me on this journey through space and time. Until next time, keep looking up, keep pushing forward, and remember, we are the species that turns nightmares into triumphs, one impossible challenge at a time.